Hi, I'm Keri Elmsly, Executive Director of Programming. Welcome to ACMI. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands we're on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. I'd like to welcome you and welcome José Luis de Vicente and Rafael Lozano-Hemmer. They're here fresh from their opening of Atmospheric Memory in Sydney at the Powerhouse. I was there too. And it's a really significant piece of work that I encourage you all to get to during the run. And I wanted to use the opportunity of you visiting us here to unpack a little bit about your very long-standing creative relationship, which is multiple decades long. I mean, I've known you both for nearly 20 years, and it's been so interesting to track the paths that you've trodden and the worlds that you inhabit, both separately and together. And I would love I'm just going to quick turbo biog you. I'm not going to say what years you were born. Rafael, you studied chemistry originally. You are Mexican and Canadian. I mean, you're a media artist, and we're going to debate that point later. Apparently, you create platforms for public participation, and surveillance has been a persistent theme in your work. You're the first artist to represent Mexico at the Venice Biennale in 2007, and you've shown all over the world globally. I won't list them. José Luis is a curator and cultural researcher, the founding art curator of Sonar, the incredible festival in Barcelona. And you've most recently transitioned from being an independent researcher and curator globally into being a museum director at Barcelona's Design Museum. So we're all treading some really interesting paths, and I think I'd like to kick you off to kind of explain to us how atmospheric memory somehow is a decade-long conversation between the two of you that we're now all entering into. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much for having us, and thanks for all of you to deciding to spend this evening with us. We are aware there's a football match going on in which some of us have a lot of vested interest. So should there be any important development, please do not refrain from communicating it to all of us. I'm not a big football person, but Rafael is a very big football person, so I think he's very angsty. We come exactly from Sydney, from the opening of this project that, as Keri was saying, it's a long time in the making. It's a project whose foundations started, in a way, in the conversation for me and a series of works that Rafael had been developing in the early 2010s about biometrics and about actually our relationship with our political and also poetic relationships with biometric signals like the breath, like breathing, and the inside-outside relationship that we develop with the atmosphere and with the air that we breathe. And atmospheric memory, it's a very ambitious project. We're very happy to be able to present it again because it's not easy hosting this project. It requires a specific scale that we started imagining for the Manchester International Festival, which is one big festival in the UK that takes place every 2 years that makes possible new commissions and specializes in collaborations, which in that way, it was really perfect for this. And in trying to think what we were trying to achieve with atmospheric memory, I think we're going to put a few ideas on the table, really hoping that between now and the end of the year, if you have the chance to pass through Sydney, you can see it and see it yourselves. Talking with Rafael about what this project for me stood about, in a way, we kind of like bump into this idea. It's a recent idea that I've been thinking about, not only in relation to this project, but other projects that I've been doing, which is the dramaturgy of the Anthropocene. And here I put in the asterisk because we know Anthropocene is a problematic and incomplete term. We know that it kind of like alludes to this new geological age where the action of man has kind of like become the biggest driver of transformation in planetary systems. But for some people, not all humans should be actually blamed equally, and also for other people's actually theories of the Anthropocene kind of like need to incorporate the decolonial narrative that actually place it much earlier in time. So this is really a placeholder for an idea that that it's quite obvious to all of us, which is that we live in a planet that is undergoing, has been undergoing a very radical transformation. And in a way, we do not live in the same planet that our grandparents live. Like the biological, geological, and planetary scale systems of the Earth are changing very rapidly. And this quotation by Bruno Latour it's helpful for us to try to understand what we're trying to do with some of the elements in this project. The idea that if historically we have treated in a way in the narratives or in the stories of mankind, the background as the scenography, the setting, that the environment was everything that was happening around us and we are the protagonists of history. Right now we cannot tell history without in a way incorporating and recognizing the importance and the role of these actors demanding and requiring a central role on stage. And this idea that the decor, the winds, the background, the whole building have come on stage or are competing with the actors, which are humans, for the principal role. Which was a way of saying that we cannot really tell the stories of today without telling the stories of the particles suspended in the air, the jellyfish propagating themselves and thriving in the oceans, the extreme weather events that change the colors of the sky, that all of these different events, we are as much protagonists of a narrative of today or how we think of the today as we humans are. Atmospheric Memory is a project that, in a way, started as a conversation of trying to produce an artifact that would not behave exactly through the parameters of the exhibition space, that would incorporate some elements from the theatrical. Rafael have always, in his work, kind of like pointed to the idea that the origin of his work is in theater and in performance. So what he's doing in many cases is creating performative systems and performative technologies that in a way are, as he says, incomplete, that are only completed by the action of the users with them. So this idea kind of like pointed us to imagining a space that would perform stories that would tell these stories about non-human actors that are part of our common heritage, and actually that looking at a time span of 200 years since the beginning of industrialization on a massive scale and the injection of CO2 in the atmosphere would recognize where do we come from and how actually we've been building in a way, how did we get here through a series of levels. And we started being very interested in the tradition of performative architecture, if you will. I remember that we were thinking that what if this is not really something that you kind of like expect to experience like an exhibition, but it's an architecture, it's a dramatic environment, it's almost a theatrical machine, and it's a system in which the visitors, users are the one who become the actors in operating all the different elements that make up this project. And something that I always say that I really like about Rafael's practice is that when art and technology, new media art was emerging as a movement and as a moment in the late 90s, beginning of the 2000s, people was not always thinking about history and precedents. We were still under the idea of the shock of the new and the fascination of the new, that new in new media that you hate very much, right? Like that the new are in new media like disgusts you profoundly.
Yeah.
One of the things that we like here is the idea that everything has a history, and actually recognizing and acknowledging that history not only is not a problem, but actually it's a plus. It's kind of like something that adds up to the texture and to the realities of your project. So by thinking in these ideas of performative architecture that kind of like operate within the realm of the sensorial, we were thinking about precedents like Le Corbusier's and Janis Xenaki's Philips Pavilion for the World Expo in Brussels. That is this famous example of a building that contained one of the first musical compositions that was an audiovisual composition made up of multiple audio channels and different projection systems that would in a way perform the building, actually act within the building. And also Xenaki's Cenotopes, which were musical compositions that took the form of light sculptures, light structures that would be suspended in the sky, and where the relationships between music, sound, and light would evolve throughout time at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. In one of the first auditoriums where you will be expected to exist lying on the floor, looking up, because that would be the position in which you would be existing. Or multiple forms of unstable and variable architectures, like the Pepsi Pavilion in the Osaka Expo in 1970 by Experiments in Art and Technology, one of the first soft buildings performed through the production of smoke and water mist to create an unstable architecture. These were ideas that were very much falling and present in what was going to be this theatrical machine, this performative theatrical piece of technology that we were going to. Oh, there's also another example that we really like. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's spherical auditorium, one of the first circular auditoriums that actually now it's being reclaimed, and there are like many people who are trying to revisit this idea of multiple speaker systems where sound will be coming at you not from the frontal but from multiple directions, and actually Stockhausen would write compositions for this notion of the auditorium that engulfs you. In this idea of creating this system that would take the atmosphere as a point, we work in Manchester International Festival with the idea of building not only the pieces, not only the journey, but the architecture itself. And we had to build with containers this emerging box in which the dramaturgy of atmospheric memory was going to take place, like one huge container structure of 40 meters per 16 per 13 meters. That is where the project would start taking shape throughout the 2 weeks that it took place there. And then a pandemic happened. And then during the pandemic, the project kind of like had a small brief visit to the US in Carolina. And then after the end of the pandemic, we got the opportunity to revisit atmospheric memory for presenting it in Australia. And it's premiering in 2023, 4 years later after its first incarnation. The building in which atmospheric memory was staged for the first time in Manchester was the first train station in history. The Manchester terminal of the line linking Manchester with Liverpool, a building of high significance in the history of the Industrial Revolution. And the one in which we are doing it in Sydney is the powerhouse, which was, of course, the main power station powering Sydney at the very end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. So it's kind of like also interesting for us that we can stage this dramaturgy about the history of the Earth, its carbonization and its conquest, in places and in locations that are historically significant to tell these stories about the atmosphere. And I think that Rafael now will guide you through what the project is and how it operates.
Thank you, José Luis, and thank you, Keri, for having us. So in thinking about this idea of precedents, not being impressed with the notion of new, I keep on looking for different types of inspiration and traditions of experimentation that go back decades or hundreds of years. As everybody, I encounter, of course, Charles Babbage. And one of the things that was fascinated about Babbage is I think that he's a little bit of a misunderstood person. He does, of course, come from a romantic tradition. He does come from the beginning of the industrialization and the automation of industrialization. But he had a lot of poetics that I think that to an extent have not been explored enough. And so if you don't know Charles Babbage, among other things, he 200 years ago made this design for the difference engine, an automated calculator, which would allow to automate the tedious processes of creating these logarithmic tables and other type of actuarial tables that were being done by computers, which meant people, mostly women, who would do this by hand. So he wanted to use steam engine to create this automation. Then he got distracted by a better design called the analytical engine, which was a programmable computer, which famously was to be programmed by Ada Lovelace as the first software. And Ada Lovelace already spoke about this machine as something that could be useful, for example, in the creation of music. So as my teenage kids would call this a flex. We actually have the difference engine on view in the Powerhouse Museum, as well as the correspondence between Babbage and Lovelace. Apparently the Babbage family that has a lot of family members here in Australia, they donated this correspondence to the Powerhouse Museum. So this is all on view as the very first part that you see. But importantly, is the Ninth Bridgewater Treatise, which is a book written in 1837, where Babbage says the following. He says, look, as we speak, we create a turbulence in midair with our breath, right? What would happen if we had a computer that was so sophisticated that we could actually map the trajectory of all these air molecules and then rewind them in such a way that we could hear all the voices of the past? So for Charles Babbage, the atmosphere is a vast library that contains all the voices of everybody who has spoken in the past. So to him, for example, he mentions listening to long-lost loved ones. Your mom is dead, now you can hear her voice again. Extinct languages, promises unfulfilled. And in one particular moment of this book, in the second reprint of the first edition, he adds a paragraph that speaks about finding evidence of wrongdoing, like slave owners getting away with murder, and all of their deeds were being recorded in the atmosphere. And one day, these computers would be able to find this evidence and seek justice. Whoa. So this document is the beginning of atmospheric memory. It's the promise of perfect recollection. And so what José Luis and I started thinking about is, well, how can we create a project that has a dramaturgical arc that starts with this kind of very utopian 19th century idea of perfect recollection and then speaks to our moment. So I'm going to show you the 1 minute long ad, just because we really want you to go see it. So the project is a complex piece in the sense that it mixes original objects from the 19th century, many of them from, in this case, the Powerhouse collection, together with contemporary artworks, not just artworks of mine, but also, for example, in the case of this work here in Sydney, we worked, for example, with Maralinga artist Joanny Scares to have her hand-blown glass works in juxtaposition with things like boomerangs and other kinds of indigenous, collections. And then that in contrast with other works, which I will show you in a minute. So this is, for example, the very first room that you enter. Is a room where there's a number of exhibits that try to materialize the atmosphere. So we start with this desire to, well, what would it look like to actually see the words created in mid-air? And so inspired by this depictions of the turbulence, the eddies, the Navier-Stokes sort of volutes that were created by voices in Mexican codices, but also we have there the banderoles in Raymond Lull. We created a system of laser tomography with NYU University to measure what was the actual shape of the breath as you spoke. In Spanish, we have a word for it, el hálito. And so we actually created this, think of it as bread slices of density with the laser, and then we used a thing called photogrammetry to create a 3D model of the actual breath of the person as they spoke. And then we 3D printed that, and we created the world's first 3D printed speech bubble. So this is, in fact, a little device. I really like that the voice was the size of your hand. And sometimes I lie and I say that this first 3D printed speech bubble is the word fuck, because I really like that it's like a projectile and so on. But in fact, of course, it's actually the word eau from French, au clair de la lune, because the first 3D printed speech bubble is actually a homage to de Martinville, who was a French inventor 20 years before Edison's phonograph. He made the first human voice recordings with soot and wax, and what he said is au clair de la lune. So this is the phrase: the mouth is to the right and time flows from left to right. If the same person said the same thing, the shape of this structure would be completely different. So when we invite you to come to the show to what we say, touch the atmosphere, this is what we celebrate, the irrepeatability of the motion or the presentation of breath, and we ask people to touch it. Other examples, we had the privilege of working with Pauline Oliveros, the great American accordionist and avant-garde composer, who famously coined the terms deep listening. And we asked her to breathe into this brown paper bag. And then we connected this brown paper bag to a bespoke respirator that we made at my studio that makes this brown paper bag inflate and deflate 10,000 times a day, which is the normal respiratory frequency for an adult at rest. The machine also does about 145 sighs, because that's the average, like that. And what's important is that this little brown paper bag is actually fried chicken brown paper bag. So it's lined with plastic. So it keeps the breath of Pauline Oliveros circulating. Now, she died 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And this is now the last breath of Pauline Oliveros. Fortunately, she had a sense of humor to be in this biometric portrait. But of course, it's a ridiculous attempt to capture the essence of a person, especially in a mechanical bellows when she was herself an accordionist. So this is on view. Another work is, for example, this is called the Babbage Nano Pamphlets. We engraved the Ninth Bridgewater Treatise into 2 million flakes of pure gold leaflet, 150 atoms thick at Cornell's Nanotech lab. And what I did is, before asking for permission, I put 50,000 of these flakes in my hand, and then I went to the air conditioning of the museum and I went like that, so that at any given time, you're breathing the entirety of the book. And I didn't ask permission because when I first created this work at Cornell, they forbid me from releasing the particles, which is ridiculous because gold is biologically inert. And if you just take the book, nothing happens to you. And then other exhibits, many of them from the 19th century, many starting to talk about the fact that, well, what is the atmospheric memory is, in fact, the residue of 421 parts per million of carbon dioxide that industrialization that Babbage helped automate created. Or, for example, this is an Amazon Alexa cut in half, showing the 7 microphones that are constantly listening to you and tracking where you are in a room. So the idea that we do live in a society where everything is recorded, and do we want that? So it starts going like that, and then you go into a room. So I'm only giving you like about 5 of the or 10 of the pieces in the show. There's actually over 70 pieces if you include the exhibits from the Powerhouse. This is an artwork called Atmosphonia, and it consists of 3,000 loudspeakers, each of which plays a different field recording. So we have, for example, 300 different species of birds. We have 200 different species of insects and so on. And as you walk, this little aura or little disc follows you and triggers the sound. So let's hear what it sounds like. And it grows over time. So if we could eavesdrop into and tune into all the sounds of the atmosphere, what kind of cacophony would that produce? And so ultimately it produces this wave-like sound, but it's actually not fair in the video. When you're there and you listen closely, you can really tune to the different channels that are being presented. So it's, I wouldn't say it's a pleasant experience, but it's certainly an experience. And then finally, you go in through a set of different pieces. You end up in the chamber. The chamber, think of it as an immersive environment with projections in the round. But with José Luis, we've been trying to be careful with the word immersive, because not only, I mean, if you're relating to, say, Janet Cardiff and George Beers Miller or William Kentridge, or, you know, different traditions of immersion, like, for example, experiments in art and technology, then we're good. But if what we're talking about is these oniric, play shows that show you these virtual butterflies and flowers that are presented in a playful, oniric environment, I mean, I have a problem with that to the degree that it's trying to take us away from the actual butterflies that are being decimated by an extinction event or flowers or so on. So is there a world where we can create something in an immersive environment that instead of separating us from reality, kind of brings us back to question or to highlight the different types of power asymmetries that exist? So I don't know if atmospheric memory is an example of it, but we sure tried. So the room is constantly transforming itself. If you do go, it's 40-minute cycle of 10 different scenes. And I won't give it all away, but basically it's a piece that starts with a very sort of romantic idea and then gradually starts going into a dystopia. So among the things that we did to work at the powerhouses, we worked closely with curators working with indigenous cultures. We were curious, or not curious, we were fascinated by the 60,000 years that we were educated on. And when you're trying to think about, well, what would the atmosphere of Australia sound like? Well, you got to take, you know, a close look at this indigenous cultures. We did not want it to just be like we have the oldest boomerang on view, but we also have, for example, the compositions of William Barton. You know, like we wanted to bring in poetry, contemporary artists working and integrate it into the dynamic of the project. So among the pieces that are on view is this one is quite popular. It's called Cloud Display. And it basically is a waterfall that writes in midair anything that you write, that you say. So she's saying, she says the word nation, and then nation gradually appears on the screen. And of course, it's not censored. In the past 30 years, I've never censored a piece. We're getting, the other day I walked in and somebody had written clitoris. And it was really good. Like it, you know, to see in a museum an 8-meter wide word clitoris, it felt right. When we did this project originally in Manchester, it was right at the time of Brexit, so there was a lot of fuck Brexit and whatever. And you know, it's there as it should be. Here we're getting a lot of Matildas, so there's a lot of soccer going on, and the spirit of being able to see these words and then see them disappear. This is all done with cold water vapor, like ultrasonic atomization. This is Brian Eno saying pickle, and then he's saying tax evasion. So anyway, other pieces have similar interactions. So this is anemometers that are controlled by computerized fans. This is a ripple tank that creates your voice into hammering waves. We have an endoscopic film. It's a really funny thing, this endoscopic film, because it's, I'll let you hear it for a minute. So we asked 5 actors in England to come and have this recording of their vocal cords to read the Babbage text while seeing how the actual cords vibrated the atmosphere. And they were very cute. They all came to the casting, all very well dressed and with their photo and whatever. We're like, we don't care what you look like. We're going in, and so we have these 5 people. We all look the same in the orchid that we have right here for our vocal cords. And then what happens is at the very end of each film, the endoscope comes out of the larynx and out of the nostril, and then you see the person. And we were careful to choose 5 very distinct ethnic backgrounds for the 5 actors. So it's a little reveal. So we're all the same here, but then you get to get another level, except for the smoker. That's really disgusting. Anyway, the project becomes darker over time, and then basically what happens in this project is that you realize that you are the product, that you are the person that is sort of being detected and being tracked, and that is sort of represented very much by this project called Zoom Pavilion that I did with Polish artist Krzysztof Wodyszko. Krzysztof was born in communist Poland, and in communist Poland it was illegal to have assembly of more than 2 people in public space. So there's a sophisticated set of rules that tells you how far away and for how long can you be with another person before the activity, the contact, is seen as suspicious or even illegal. So we put all the rules of the communist handbook onto this massive digital surveillance piece that has sort of overhead tracking, facial recognition, skeletal tracking, and perspective views, and create this massive motherboard of surveillance. So I'm giving it away, but basically it's about the relationships, the idea that the atmosphere is not neutral, the idea that there needs to be a kind of Brechtian noticing of the knots to bring out those mechanisms of surveillance. This continues, and people really enjoy it, which is kind of weird. And by the way, this is 3 years before Ai Weiwei did the same thing at the Armory badly. So I just wanted to say that. Anyway, the point of this project ultimately is that you're also being tracked in relation. That was a really important part, especially now with the sense of COVID and the sense of negotiating the distance between people. And then it ends with this moment, which we call recognition, where everybody who's been in the show is actually being recorded with quite ominous technologies. This is actually a Tisney. That basically calculates how people look and assembles people by their likeness. So it puts together, basically it's a racial profiling system, and you hear all of the sound and all of the recordings of what they've done. And then this is presented, right at the boundary between the seduction of participation, where you see yourself, kind of like reality TV or selfies or all the kind of, narcissistic stuff, and then the violence of the more sinister kind of mechanisms by which we're using computers to classify people. And of course, we are not divorced at all from the desire to control people. So I acknowledge that we're complicit with what we denounce. And then it ends with this moment where all of Babbage's texts and Lovelace's texts explode into the room. It's a little moment with some Cocteau twins. I was just criticized for using Cocteau twins. First of all, they're great. What's wrong with you? Second of all, it's like, well, why would you put in the middle of quite a dystopian project this kind of moment? And the best I could do is think about, do you guys remember in Magnolia when Amy Mann starts singing for no reason? And all of the characters in this really depressing moment, they all just sort of take this moment to take a breather with it. It's kind of like that. And it's a moment also that creates a very tangible, the cloud display becomes this waterfall, and it becomes a very tangible sort of atmospheric effect. The project, this is a part that people love, and it's kind of like this promise of immersion is delivered. And that's basically it. I want to talk about one last project real quick, and this is not part of atmospheric memory, sadly, but it can be. It's a project from 2013, which is basically an invitation for people to go into a hermetically sealed cabin where you're invited to breathe the air that has been breathed by everybody before you. So you walk into this decompression chamber, and then you walk into this main cabin and you sit down and you breathe all the viruses, bacteria, and pheromones of the people before you. There are massive warnings on the wall. It's really a disgusting project. Warnings against contagion because there are no filters, but also against panic because to get out of the cabin, you need to go through the decompression chamber, and against asphyxiation because there's only 10 days of oxygen. We ask people to be there no more than 10 minutes. And then as you sit there, the breath that is being recycled over months of exhibition actually leaves through a set of bellows and valves that actuate 61 brown paper bags, which is 5 octaves, the number of keys that the organs that we use to inspire this project use. So in this project, a couple of notes about it that I think is important on the debate of for example, media art is, oftentimes you'll see people like myself talk about interaction as a really positive thing. We're thinking about, well, you will have agency and you will be able to personalize the show. And this is, there's all this positive language of it. In this project, if you participate too much, you die. And crucially, it's your participation that makes the air more toxic for future participants. The reason I care about this project in the sense of atmospheric memory is, did any of you see that horrible John Travolta film where he's the bubble boy?
Yeah.
It's his immune deficiency.
Yeah.
Well, the way I see it is we're 8 billion people and we're all John Travolta. We are all sharing this fragile little bubble, right? And so a project like this forces you to engage with the fact that the air is the commons and it is not boundless, that it's limited. And that apparently it's really stinky. And you get that whiff of the future. So I just wanted to show that one. And now, a quick slide just to say that this project is made by a lot of people in my team in Montreal, but also here in Australia, a lot of curators and participants to it. Okay, so.
Just to wrap up a few things before opening a wider conversation.
Yeah, I've got a few questions for you.
Yeah. At the beginning of the current version of atmospheric memory in Sydney, you enter a cabinet and you are requested an action. And this action actually, which is a playful conversation with an artificial intelligence, becomes part of a bigger thing. Actually, it becomes part of a moment that will, and not spoiling things, become in a way a bigger part in the latest show. Atmospheric memory in this production through the atmospheric chamber, this big space of a stage for the atmosphere, is also in a way recognizing, and this is something that interested us a lot, that to a certain extent, Babbage's utopia of the library of the air, of every action of the past being able to reside vibrating in the air and it can be computed back, it is the contemporary nightmare of surveillance capitalism. It is a nightmare of a world where a living room where you have sitting a device like this, an Amazon Echo that you can see on the inside in the show, is pointing 7 microphones at you all the time, that is permanently listening, so that the moment that you say, Alexa, what time it is, it actually can pick you up, your voice, and become part of a planetary scale wide infrastructure that literally encompasses the whole planet, from data centers to submarine cables, to being able to produce this permanent recollection of actions, of memories, and of instances. And at some point in the development of the show, when we were weighing, this piece of news really struck us in a way. The idea that when you are talking to your Alexa or to Siri, these recordings will sometimes end up in centers where people, employees of Amazon or Apple, have to listen to these recordings to detect outliers in the training of the artificial intelligence models that make these systems operate. So there is people whose job is listening to the same word again and again and again in recordings happening in people's homes, unaware to them, to produce this huge catalog of the mundane actions of the everyday that actually are then exploited and are in a way commodified and become the basis of an industry that Shoshana Zuboff coined as surveillance capitalism, with this capacity to turn every intimate personal action in something that is commodifiable, that can be commodified and then sold, circulated with, but more importantly now in the new regime or artificial intelligence, also mine and put at the service of training systems that actually will produce a new form of agency that has not been negotiated with all of us, but that has been building on this library of the air, on this infinite catalog of day-to-day actions. And of course, for us, it was very striking that in the same moment and in the same place that Babbage was writing his text about the library of the air, he was using the steam engine to power his differential engine in Manchester, in one of the few first places of the birth cradles, really, of industrial revolution. It's when the actual memory of the atmosphere, which is all the CO2 that we start burning in the mid-19th century and putting in the air, it starts piling up. And actually, we make this journey from the 280 parts per million of CO2 in the moment that Babbage wrote those words to the carbon 425 and rising. One of the pieces in the show is a clock that shows you how the concentration of CO2 piling up in the atmosphere becomes a memory that completely transforms our relationship with a commons, the atmosphere, and this is kind of like the dimension of the project that we want to put in the center, that we will have to transmit to future generations and that actually we have owned in a way, we have exploited to multiple ways, and we are the generation that has to make the transition into the zero emissions wall, the wall of 2050, where according to the Paris Agreement, we have to transition into a zero emissions model for the sake of future generations, of those who come behind us that cannot, will not have the possibility to thrive without this consciousness on our side of what is we are doing regarding this global commons that is the atmosphere. This is for us actually kind of like the final parting moment in this dramaturgy that talks about the narratives, and I think this has become very important, of computation, of decarbonization, and also here in Australia of decolonization, which has been very important.
And just to say one last thing is, if you guys have ever seen an immersive show that doesn't suck, there's not many, but one is the Iñárritu, Carne y Arena. If you get a chance of seeing this VR piece, it's absolutely wonderful. You get to see the experience, first-person experience of crossing the U.S.-Mexico border and the harrowing experience of the people who do this routinely. And then you're full of solidarity and empathy, and there's a sense of real urgency. But then when the only problem with this piece is that you leave through just a very fancy cappuccino cafe with fancy donuts and stuff. So what we wanted is at the end of our piece to have a library, like a call to action, a location where there would be documents, manifestos, your lists of MPs, how to actually take some of the information that was given there to those who are interested and have an action moment. So that's how it ended. We gave it all away.
Yeah.
It's like you don't go see it.
No, please do.
Well,
it was a lot of work.
it's okay. You can relax now.
Right.
It's open. It's all good. Well, I think one of the things I wanted to start with is, we talked a lot about surveillance capitalism and the meaning behind everything that you've created for huge audiences. Working at the scale means you are intending to engage multiple thousands of citizens in what is a really, you just whipped us through 40 minutes of pretty deep complexity. And then we talk about how long do people actually spend playing versus understanding? And what have you noticed, given the sort of headlines right now around the fear around even the understanding of AI? As you watch your audiences in Manchester and now in Sydney, what are you noticing about how they take it in?
Well, it's hard to generalize because there are people, and this is on purpose, we want to make sure that there's enough loose ends in the project that if you're coming for that colossal Instagrammable moment, there is that. We do care about being able to have a very diverse group of people coming through the door. The spirit is that if you scratch the surface, that you will find other material that maybe will evoke something more critical or poetic as a reaction. We are seeing people engaging with the project in very interesting ways. First of all, I should say that it's rich for us to fly 10 people from Europe and North America to set this up and then pontificate about carbon emissions and so on, while also using all of this gear. The answer to that is we acknowledge the complicity with what we denounce. We understand that we're not offering any messianic solutions to the problem, but the possibility of infecting people at the level of, especially younger people, at the level of creativity and about what an artwork, what kind of questions an artwork can pose, it's being successful. And the reason I say it's being successful is because in that action room, just in 2 days, we've had so much participation where it's just wallpapered with people's proposals and drawings and manifestos. And I'm very encouraged by that. Ultimately, as artists, we can ask questions, but then as citizens, I feel like it's interesting to intervene and to not just follow business as usual.
One I think of the things with this project is that Rafael always talks about it, that it's not an immersive show, it's an immersive show. It's a way of joking with that idea. And there is a certain tension between the fact that our understanding of interaction is inherently playful. There's the idea that interaction, especially in reactive pieces, is this almost dance between you and the system and what you do to the system, how this engages you, surprises you. But some parts of atmospheric memory are very extractivist and exploitative in the sense that that's actually literally taking things from you that it's going to then put to another use, and actually it's going to take intimate moments and it's going to blow them up at a huge scale. Or there's a moment in the show where you have this sentence, "I can breathe," which comes from very specific incidents of police violence that is blown to the scale that we usually in immersive shows will give to flowers and butterflies, as we say, or Van Goghs. So there are these tensions between what the box and what the language expects from you and the way that we actually put it to use in a context where we are definitely kind of like embracing the scale and the spectacularity. Like it's many of the references that were given in the beginning, like experiments in technology, or all these projects were done in the context of Universal Expos, which were huge celebrations where you were showing actually in a way for the everyone, for the everybody, a capacity to surprise and to enlighten from a radical wheel of experimentation. And there was like a tension there, of course, between Stockhausen being and the Osaka 1970 World Expo doing a form of sound composition that had not been done anywhere else, while at the same time giving a spectacle. You know, it's like providing the scale of the spectacular for the everyone. And this is, of course, a thing here. When this is the new immersive show, atmospheric memory, is a sentence that already kind of course, makes us talks about the tension in the project that is very deliberately trying to subvert what happens to you in an immersive show and giving you some moments, of course, of delightfulness at the same time that it can be exploitative, that it can be manipulative. Yeah.
I mean, I watched the confrontation at that section of the show where everyone had been like saying their one word. And isn't it amazing how uninvented we are? Uninventive. Like I said Beyonce. Like I couldn't come up with a better word for
great.
that. But it's
Did it work?
Well, yeah, it said Beyonce, sure, but I felt really stupid. And in fact, one of the things I noticed is as people's realization of that surveillance and how awful everyone looked as well, that the mood in the room really switched. And I'm actually encouraged by you switching to that sort of dramaturgy and entertainment closing, because how would anyone know to leave? I mean, there's some real fundamentals where it's like, okay, now we've taken you right to the edge. You can go now and maybe feel a little bit better about it. But I think there's something about the opportunity of scale when, like with World Expos and EAT experiments, is there's a very unique moment when a practitioner gets access to a large budget and a large place. And then we get the opportunity to start to experiment with tools, in this case, technology. It's like, that's an irresistible combination. And it's sort of what you do with them. And I want to sort of push us a little bit into, you mentioned Ai Weiwei, and I brought you both together in 2017 to talk about, with actually an Australian academic, Kate Crawford, to talk about creativity in the experience age at Cannes Line, which is a giant advertising brouhaha. And you spoke for 12 minutes each, and you walk through some of the projects that you've done in the 90s and the early 2000s. I literally watched 2,000 creative directors have their minds blown because they'd been copying your ideas and ideas of artists in the similar vein to you without any kind of awareness. And I think as a curator and a practitioner, I'm interested to think about how you think about impact in culture for your work and where copying and repetition has its place.
It's a tough one.
It's tricky, right?
It's a tough one, yeah. I think that there was a very interesting moment, and if I had to put dates to it, it's like end of the 90s, like late 90s to the late first 2000s, where everything that was happening in the space of applied research to art was still only happening like in a void, kind of like in a space that did not kind of like communicate so much with what was happening in other creative spaces. And at some point, kind of like the doors opened and it flowed and it cross-pollinated with many spaces. And of course, there was like a dynamic of appropriation there. I remember.
Feel like rave was that moment that
In a way,
maybe
yes,
broke the
like one of the
wealth.
multiple elements, yeah, rave culture. But from there, it's like, I think Rafael, for instance, always has this tension between I'm an artist, not a media artist, and actually getting to Venice and then being in Venice doing interactive works that still probably had not been very much shown in a context like that, but distanciation from the ghetto that new media art, that art and technology have been for a long time. Then you have things like this, like the world of creative agencies, kind of like taking over this idea of this vocabulary that in a moment was very striking. I remember where there was a moment that everybody in the scene of new media, of art and technology, were kind of like saying, well, we are the unpaid R&D arm of the advertising industry, which is like really shitty and it's not like a position that you kind of like want and desire. Things are now different because the market, the art market, has integrated and internalized many of these practices in a way that they had not before. But actually, what we've been talking lately has to do like a tension between originality and kind of like exploitation of creative work. Now we're on a totally different level because we are literally sucking millions of images
Yeah.
and from the internet and training models and systems that are actually producing output without a social negotiation that includes those who are part of that. So like the stakes have totally changed. We are like in a totally different moment.
I mean, how do you feel about it? Do you even trace it? And is there a way to flip that kind of like, oh God, I got
Yeah,
copied?
I think there's a lot to be said for perverse work. When we did Visual Circular Breathing, it was right after the CEO of Nestle had said that water was not a fundamental human right. Because he owns Evian and San Pellegrino and all these other things. So the spirit of creating a work that could never, be sponsored by Nestle or anybody is
Yeah.
something that I'm proud of.
Yeah.
Like I sometimes think about, and I have worked with companies. So
Yeah.
my statement is that I work with companies so long as they do exactly what I ask them to do. And other times, for example, some companies have approached me. One I really love to tell you is Porsche approached me because they wanted to do a art car, kind of like BMW does. And I said to them, like, wait a minute, do you know who I am? Like, what do you want me to do? It's like, well, put some LEDs on it or whatever. And I said, listen, my idea is we're going to open up in the seats, we're going to open these cavities to fit Mexicans so that we can bring them from Mexico to the United States in style. And they're like, nah, no, thank you so much. Or Amazon approached me through a curator I admire greatly. And she said, oh, we're going to do this big project in Washington, the future. We need you. And I said, okay, great. I'm your guy. But would you consider a project where Amazon announces a new philanthropic arm dealing with the health of the real Amazon? And that could be your guy who would and they're like, no. So I love to play. I think as I get older and more cynical, or not more cynical, but like a little bit more financially stable, and I have that privilege of being able to
To say
turn
no.
it down,
Yeah.
is fascinating. It's really enjoyable. And at Cannes, when we were together, what was funny is that I said this line of, only if the company does what I say. They gave me an ovation because they are always, under the brand. And I think that is so important to just stand your ground and create something that's perverse and not sponsorable.
Excellent.
It's not a good financial decision.
I'm sorry, I'm shuffling my questions now. Well, actually, that leads me to an even more sticky subject, which we touched on, where you touched on the use of the word immersive and that kind of landscape. But I'm really interested in you kind of refuting the term new media artist. And in Chelsea, at the opening of your Pace show, you'd taken the time to trace the artworks that are associated with the heartbeat back over 500 years.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to you and you were like, see, they need to pay attention to this. And then you had a review later on from someone who called your show at Pace like a selfie machine. And I'm like, there's 500 years of context right there. So for the sake of other artists, I really want people to hear from your perspective of what you don't have to be niche. The door is open for your own claiming of what it is.
Yeah, one of my favorite. I actually collect a lot of precedents, especially in Latin America. Of different types of intersection of culture and technology, like the fact that cybernetics was postulated in the National Institute of Cardiology of Mexico City. Like the first woman to ever pilot a plane was a Cuban lady. Like the first usage of neon light was Julia Cosice, stuff like that. But one of the ones that, what was I going to tell you? Wait a second. Oh yeah, one of my favorite ones is Marta Minujín, right? So I was in Paris. I was doing a show with 12 installations, all of which had a camera trained on the public, which would interact with the work. And people were saying, oh, this is new media and whatever. I'm like, listen, in 1964, Marta Minujín, this Argentinian pioneer, did this performance where she mixed live video with, trained on the public, mixed with live TV. And why this matters, two reasons. Number one is before Nam June Paik got a Porta-Pack or anything like that, or Dan Graham, or any of these people, Marta was the first person to ever use in contemporary art a live camera trained on the public. So it's great that we have Frida Kahlo and whatever, but here's Nerd Lady doing this, you know. So break the stereotypes of Latin American. And then the second is because it's now 57 years ago that this happened. So if after 57 years of a tradition of experimentation, we're still calling it new, it's just we're lazy. We're not looking at these precedents. And she's one example of so many others where I find it so much more productive to connect to those precedents than trying to pretend that this novelty is happening. There's nothing that bothers me more than people saying, well, with this technology, we'll have infinite possibilities. It's like a canvas has infinite possibilities, or an empty page where you write, that's infinite possibilities right there. So the techno-optimist, the technologically correct, is something that I think as soon as we can exorcise out of our vocabulary, the better. And really just connect to, like I said, these other traditions.
Yeah, but it's not invisible. And I think that's the point of atmospheric memory and why the Alexa is in the show. It's like we've all complacent and given our permission at large. And when I was, again, watching the audience and your visitors, I was like, is anyone remembering that minute where we all agreed to give it all up, to give all our privacy up? And it's almost like it's in collective memory, it's probably less than 10 years ago.
That's right.
And yet now we don't even question it. So, I mean, we were debating the term, the access in the art world and the ability to self-define as an artist where you show up. And, do you think it's, since I guess you two have been working together, what's that big change? Are you seeing that playing field of artists with the kind of practice to Rafael's having more access in the world as a curator? Have you got bigger scale to work with?
I don't know exactly. Like, I think it's a very open-ended question in multiple ways.
I know.
There are many things that interest me, specific forms of practice that I think Rafael represents, and his studio, not only him, antimodular in different ways. One is the idea that the art studio and the research unit, and actually the research unit as something that outputs actual new things in the world that have an impact even beyond the constraints of the art practice, is something interesting and valid, and is a methodology of practice that today is valuable. I'm very interested in the idea of the impact of art practices beyond the constraints of the art institution and the art industry. And maybe for Rafael, that is not necessarily so relevant, but for me, it is important, this idea that actually today, artists are contributing to the production of knowledge through the development of new technologies, of political systems that use different kind of incentives in the configurations of the technologies they use, that those things actually have they do percolate beyond the context of their practice. And I think we talk about this in different ways in the work that you do in antimodular, when you work with scientists and then put out with papers and methodologies in pieces like this, where there's been, in many cases, new actually contributions.
But not new. So I would say alien. Alien is better. Like not progress, but progression. Like variations. And I think that that's important because there's that novelty again, the sense of, we, in my studio, we operate as an R&D company. So the reason I can support so many developers as part of my team is because the Canadian government decided, bless their heart, that we're actually an R&D company. And so they support our R&D, and that's amazing. But it's still that cult of novelty. As far as I'm concerned, if something can be done in a low-tech way or in an economic way, I'm so interested in it. So it's not about the novelty. It's more this word alien as a suggestion for replacement. It's about something that does not belong, that somehow is like an interruption in the way that we do things. That's where I think instead of novelty, we can just talk about this interruption.
I think
Yeah.
that's
And not disruptive.
I'm not sure that's what
Not
I meant
disruptive,
exactly.
yeah.
Like in terms like because it's not like this obsession, anti-new obsession, which is kind of like also that is also the need for historicizing that also in art is very important. Lev Manovich said this thing that the problem with contemporary art is that it was too aware of its history, and the problem with new media art is that it was not enough.
That's
and I
cool.
think you are stuck somewhere there in the middle,
Right,
and then
yeah.
kind of looking one way or the other, depending on the moment. But it's more like the laser tomography to produce the actual shape of the breathing. This could be happening in a lab, and it could not be happening necessarily in a gallery. And actually, the bridging of the space between the lab and the gallery, the paper and the art piece, I think is a super interesting kind of like a space of practice today. And the fact that that your studio has a qualification of an R&D unit, and actually that is being funded by R&D money, not only by arts and culture money, which is becoming more and more, I think, important today as we understand that arts is a space of production of knowledge that intersects and interacts with all the other spaces of production of knowledge.
It requires a mixed economy as well. So there is never enough. And when you have to operate only in one space, then it's very limiting how you can fund it, or how you can be paid for it, or how you can share it. I think we're at a good time to see if our audience have any questions for you two, because we could go on for hours. There's a microphone, and someone's going to give it to you.
This is extraordinary, and I'm thrilled I came. I just wanted to say, like, the way you're using nightmare and magic and all these things, it like my brain was bouncing around to things I love, like the Museum of Broken Relationships in Zagreb, to George Saunders' short story, to Jonathan Keats, the conceptual artist. And I guess I was just thinking, like, what are your inspirations? Because there's such an amusement to it, and it's so exciting, and then you just crush people. And that's what I like doing in my work.
No.
So,
Who did I crush? I hope not. I'm sorry.
In the good way.
I am sorry. I do live in Canada. We're really good for apologizing. So whenever I feel that kind of Latino thing, I can always just recall Canadian sorry. I have other ideas. No, and also I'm very caffeinated, so I apologize if I do love Ai Weiwei. I think he's a great artist, but there is a moment where you have to be very careful about opportunism, right? Like this moment where there's such a relationship of such a strange balance that you need to keep if you're working, say, with the images of the Syrian boy in the Turkish beach, you know, like the conditions of privilege that we have as artists who are successful, and we have this privilege of working with teams and so on and so forth, I think need to be always emphasized and acknowledged. Yeah, so for example, here in Australia, like one of the things that happened is we studied with the help of the curators of the Powerhouse some of the history of Australia. And that was just absolutely fascinating. Learning about, for example, deep time, or learning about, for example, David Dungay Jr. Like José Luis Vicente was saying that, you know, we use the voice of Eric Gardner in the middle of the performance. All of a sudden you hear this African-American being asphyxiated with the call of our time, which is, I can't breathe. But that's the same call that George Floyd did, and is the same call that David Dungay Jr. did here in Australia as he was asphyxiated. So the spirit of expanding and learning with expert systems, like I just love the possibility of listening and learning from people who have this knowledge. So I think of the artwork always as a becoming, as a thing in process. We don't want to just land atmospheric memory like a UFO. We want to learn, you know, who are the activists, who are the people who can inspire this work. And a lot of it came from that conversations about indigenous culture. I personally love poetry. I think poetry, my girlfriend's a poet, and I get educated on poetry. I think that there is a world in which the literary is a great precedent and a great inspiration. So I look a lot at Bioy Casares and Borges and all the people that are normal, plus the science fiction. So just the normal sort of desires. I should say one thing though, that is, I am fascinated by the fact that on the subject of AI, we were talking a little bit about AI before, is, everybody's talking about like, well, artists will disappear and whatever. It's like, nah, here's what we do better than computers. We die. And this is so fundamental because try this, computer. Montaigne said that to philosophize is to learn how to die. And I really think that making art is really coming to terms with the fact that our life is finite, that we are all universally going in there, that this ephemeral performance reminds us to live in the now, memento mori and all that. And I think that that's most art, whether it's media art or whatever, is addressing those issues, issues such as that finite nature. So I'm really excited by all the Gothic, all the, the New York Times called me the death-loving crowd pleaser. And I think that that's a perfect term. I was really happy with that headline. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Can I just ask a question about your work is really exploring the intersection of science and art. And I'm interested in how you see how they inform each other. Like is science the tool or is science the inspiration? They're kind of disparate disciplines. In some ways they relate to each other, in some way they inspire each other, but too often we find it very difficult to account them in the same sphere. Yeah, I think you addressed that poetically. I wonder how you can reconcile such disparate disciplines.
I think one thing, for instance, in this project that was very important is that the project, both here and in Manchester originally, kicks off with Charles Babbage's difference engine, and it's there, physically there. Now I find very surprising that you have science and industry museums that have these relics, if you will, and I like relic because it's a word with religious overtones. Like here you have this chunk of metal, which is literally the beginning of the age of computation. And you don't have to kind of like maybe idolatrize it or consider it like some sort of, we said Rosetta Stone, or we said like the Secret Shroud, but it's just not its technical principle. It's way much more than its technical principle. And then by actually with this project entering into science museums, in a way capturing that object and not only presenting it from the perspective of historical importance, but it's symbolic, poetical, mythical, political, kind of like unraveling in multiple ways. And some days when I get super radical, I think there should not be science museums and art museums, that this kind of like articulation is a problem to start with. And we should have museums of the air, museums of the ocean, museum of the light, museums of emotions. I don't know, like we can decontextualize however as we want. But in this project, kind of like the same idea that in a way, grabbing the legacy of 19th century history of science, which becomes, and we know that for a long time, something that sits at the basis of our, in a way, spiritual, in many cases also, the production of an imaginary, which is the world in which we've lived, all people of our generation. That, I think, in this project was something very striking, and we still cannot believe that Charles Babbage is literally in the building, right? He's in the room, yeah.
And I mean, I would say that it depends who's asking, right? Like if I find myself among people who are proposing that we live in some kind of new renaissance where art and technology and Leonardo's are happening all over, I'm like, no. I don't have a tolerance for that, because as a trained scientist, I do understand that there's a lot of intersections. So everybody, both the arts and science, we are committed to exploring uncertainty and indeterminacy and complexity and research and the unknown. That's what puts them together. But in science, you're seeking to create formulas or patterns or predictive mechanisms that help you really speak to the nature of phenomena itself. And it's looking for answers. Whereas in art, though it's not a juxtaposition that's perfect, we like complexity, we like ambiguity, we like perversity, we don't like the answer.
And you
we
create
like
the questions.
You create the questions, you let it explode and disrupt established systems of knowledge. So I do think if I'm speaking to curators of contemporary art museums, then you should hear me talk about science as culture. And I really believe that a lot of established art and humanities looks at science in a very 19th century way, where they're still thinking positivism and utilitarianism and stuff like that, whereas science is a site of such intense creativity and just the outright weird ass behavior. And so depends who I'm speaking to. I flip.
But I like to be a bit of contrarian, and I think that a bit of that divide that you're expressing is also old-fashioned, in the sense that I don't think it really represents how things are done today. Same as you collect stories of origins of Latin American media art, I collect things like papers co-written by artists and scientists, not as a kind of like rarity, but actually as a sign of specific methodologies and full fields that actually require for those kind of agents to be on the table for it to happen. And there's data visualization that comes from the collision of graphic design, cognitive psychology, and information design, and statistics. Now, for instance, sound ecology, and specifically marine sound ecology, where scientists doing field recordings and sound artists working in the space of field recording suddenly are using the same tools for different reasons and then clash or collide with each other. Or designers working in synthetic biology, who, when you're actually making the case for a new bacteria, a synthetic bacteria, the social scenario in which it is inserted cannot be defined by the scientists, but can be defined by designers and artists. So actually, the idea that there is a very thriving space for that, and that is a reality of 2023, that for me is very important.
Fact, that 3D printed speech bubble actually produced 2 scientific papers.
This is what I mean.
Was about the distribution of visualizing how contagion happened, because this was before COVID, so how actually contagion happened. And the second one was about people that have lisps and being able to use the method of laser tomography to detect how they were actuating the air and being able to remedy that. And so I like that a lot. I like the idea that there is a hybrid space that can be exhibited. What I don't like is this kind of simplification of like art versus science, or art and science together.
Well,
That's both bad.
I mean, if you look at Libby Heaney's Instagram stories about trying to share about how quantum computing and slime and foam and sponge in less than a minute, she's giving us access to that really, really complex set of ideas that are going to inherently impact how we live tomorrow. And yet she's using just something as simple as slime in a really good set of manicure. Anyway, and so the person with the microphone is going to pass it around.
Yeah, if I can ask a hypothetical question, I was fascinated by that idea of all the languages and all the words that have been spoken in history that we have no record of. And we now concede that, this question's being recorded by hundreds of devices. And as we lose sovereignty over, hardware and software, what if your R&D team in your lab found a way to access? They found the key to a box that contained all the words that were ever spoken. Would you access that box as an artist, or even as a curator or practitioner?
Yeah.
With the risks that then the data is then available to other, not just artists.
Yes, but with care, because here's the problem, is oftentimes, and it is a colonial problem really, it's like you get access to this concentration of power, of knowledge, and who gets access to that is a really important question, obviously. And so I would say that part of the problem with, current ideas of internet and Web3 and blockchain and stuff like that is that I grew up on the internet as a public space, right? A space for a variety of different views, and then it became a shopping mall, and now it's becoming these completely, closed fiefdoms like Twitter or X, where you have this, codes of conduct that have to fit a particular ideology. So, for example, I was very, very, very big proponent of GitHub, right? All of the code of my studio is actually released as open source on our GitHub. And I've been talking about this in a very, almost hippie way, saying, hey, we are not in the business of creating algorithms. We're in the business of creating experiences. If somebody else wants to use our code, here it is. But fast forward to, 2 years ago, when Microsoft buys GitHub.
Okay.
And now GitHub is, in fact, the training ground for all of their proprietary AI. And then it becomes like such an asymmetry of power.
So did you take it down?
No, it's still there.
Would you take it down?
I could, but on the other hand, see, the problem is I'm trying to distribute in an easy way, in a more popular way, the code that we're writing.
But that's the problem of access and asymmetry, is like the fact that he would get the invitation is like maybe the invitation should never go to him in the first place.
But the thing is, if you look at the Creative Commons licenses that we have our software in, if people reuse it, they will need to go to the Creative Commons license that we use for the particular software. But Microsoft is not going by that. And so the only solution that I can see for problems of this asymmetry is if we put our foot down and go for social democratic institutions, things like, antitrust legislation, and breaking down monopolies and bringing down oligarchs and taxing the shit out of these people. So I think that the solutions are there to actually moderate those abuses of power. But it's not really an answer to what you were asking, I don't think. But it goes in that direction, right? It's in how, if you are given that golden key, if you are Facebook, and you have all of the data, then do you use it to allow an extremist politician to become elected? And the answer was yes. And Kate Crawford speaks about the way in which Trump was elected in an extremely, they were using 101 technology.
Yeah.
It was like nothing compared to what's coming. So the degree of sophistication of these manipulations is increasing exponentially. And so I just think that what's most important is for all of us to have this position of data is not neutral. The atmosphere is not neutral. Everything has prejudices that are built into these systems. And all we can do, or one thing we can do is, like Raymond Williams would say, is just underline the ways that this is not reality, that this is just a manipulation.
Can I ask how you relate to the failures in science? For example, say the...
Homeopathy?
Hey, come on.
Oh, sorry.
More along the lines of, say, the way the standard model has kind of ground to a halt, and there's not much conversation between physicists and mathematicians around gravity and
I love that stuff, because I think that that's the way forward, right? The way forward is that you constantly contest the models and you keep on hypothesizing, and then you become radically empirical, and then you have an experimental relationship to this phenomena. What's most important is that you have a certain degree of certainty that is allowed to contravene. That's what I love about science. What I love about science is that you can say, right, here is what describes, reality. And then someone else comes up and shows up on another model, and you, unlike sects, unlike faith, you turn around and say, yeah, it looks like evidence-based is showing us that this is another direction we can explore. So for me, the standard model, I'm not a physicist, and the truth is I am a chemist. I did graduate, but I forgot most of my chemistry. So I am very humbled with high energy physics and science of that regard. But I do think that what's healthy is the continued questioning of these models, that science is based on mistrust of any kind of grand theory, especially one that, my favorite story is how the God particle in the model was actually called the goddamn particle, but then the marketing people wanted to change it to God. And there is this that science itself and the search for knowledge is never separated from the will to power. Okay, so let's talk
Okay,
about that.
last
That's great.
question.
Thank you. It's been fascinating to hear you debate each other here publicly, something that didn't look arranged. I wanted to ask you, how did
It's
your
never
collaboration,
It's never arranged.
maybe it was, how did your collaboration evolve between two people who are obviously opinionated and, strong-willed? How did the dance of the collaboration end up happening and adjusting to each
What a
other?
great last question. Draw us right back to the beginning.
That's like a set of things here. Like, of course, Rafael's practice in my years, he doesn't like that I say that I'm a bit younger than him, but I'm a bit younger than him. And so his practice really was a reference for me. And in the moment of shaping what a very specific relationship of practices of computation that enter into the space of the symbolic and the aesthetic could mean and they could sustain. And I think that producing an imaginary of what you could do in that medium, as I was kind of like growing up and being interested in that, was for me very, very interesting. And then I think I started like developing my own work as a curator, and I think we've known each other for way longer than we started to work together. I needed, in a way, time to understand how to work with an artist like Rafael in a specific moment. But then at that moment, and in the case of atmospheric memory, we've done quite a good number of projects before atmospheric memory. But atmospheric memory was an idea from scratch and was like shaping this building and building it up from zero. And at some moment, I think we understood exactly what is the kind of relationship, the intellectual relationship and creative relationship that an artist and a curator play in the role of, I have a problem with curator as a word because many things that are very different among themselves are included within the word curation. And here is a combination of dialogue, partnership, research unit, references that crystallize and then open up in multiple other references. And that is something that you don't, it's almost like, it's like a hip hop battle. Like someone of two very talkative guys, and then actually, yes, and I see that, and I put all this on the table. Then you start like overlapping a million things, and then they start kind of like fitting into each other. For me, it's a privilege because it allows me to be involved in doing something that would never be able to do on my own, which is contribute to produce something as monumental as this. And I don't know for you what kind of usefulness that it has.
Well, I mean, it's many, but for example, I really like the role of an artist as parasite, and I think that we are like
that doesn't make you sound very good.
No,
it's not something you should boast about.
No, of course, yeah, no. I mean, the parasite. So you work on constraints, right? And José Luis is good at imagining different constraints for the works, and without those limits, I think that projects like this, which are complex and multifaceted, would just be completely like Aldous Pizza. I really think that the role of the curator as facilitator, as research unit, what you said, is fascinating. The spirit is performing arts. The spirit is that everybody has a role, that those roles need to be specified up front, that the artist is never creating in a vacuum, waiting for inspiration or whatever. Then inspiration happens in dialogue. And so catalyst and friend, and also like ultimately the challenge, he's faster than I am, like he speaks faster than I do. So I relax in a room when he's around. I'm like, oh, thank God, he's gonna just talk. And the problem is that he's getting faster and more interesting. So you actually have to pay attention. So you can't just tune him out. Like it's I learned a lot with you, and it's a delight to work.
A word that I've been thinking about to try to, identify some sort of methodology that is not curating is co-imagining. It's a process that something can be imagined between two people, not only like, hey, I've thought about this. It's not that I've thought about this. It's like, wouldn't it be? And then the thing becomes something that is neither what was in your mind or what was in my mind. Is something that starts taking a shape and it's a privilege. Like I've worked with many, many artists, but I almost make in a category, like my mind almost make like a division between the ones with which I can co-imagine together and the ones with which I cannot. It's a more traditional form of curation.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you both for sharing your collaboration with us. It's really fascinating to see the care and the pace at which you collaborate together with. And I really wish you the best with Powerhouse. It's a remarkable show. And yeah, thank you for sharing your practice with us. I hope you've really enjoyed the conversation, and we'll be around if you want to talk to them at the Campari bar.
Next to the game.
Yeah. And
What's
someone
what's
tell
the,
us
what's
the
the
score.
0-0.
0-0.
Good. Good. We're still going to get
Okay.
to penalties.
Nothing happened then.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.